So if you would take a minute and think about your life, like in the end of your life or at the end of your life, what do you want to be remembered for? Like when it comes to your funeral, like what do you want people to say? You know, it's interesting for me because I've officiated an incredibly large number of funerals. The previous church I was at, we were the only church in the community. So pretty much if you died in that town, I did your funeral. And what that meant, though, is that I often did funerals for people I didn't know. You know, and so I would sit down with the family, and I would just say, like, well, tell me about your loved one. Tell me what you want people to remember. You know, what do you want the tone to be? Those sort of things. And when I would ask them, like, you know, kind of what I'm asking them is, like, what's the story of your loved one that you want to share? You know, and I would hear some really great things, right? I'd hear people who were just incredibly loving to their family and all that goes with that. I remember one gentleman's I did who was like, no matter what was going on for somebody, he always would go help and he was always showing up. You know, you hear these kinds of stories, but then every once in a while, I would sit down with a family and, you know, there'd often be multiple family members, and I'd ask that question, like, what do you want folks to remember about your loved one? And it'd be a long stretch of silence. And they'd all look at each other, kind of uncomfortable. And someone would finally say, well, you know, he was a hard worker. Or you know what? She was always on time. She was so punctual. Their entire lives were summed up in one sentence, that they were a hard worker, or that she was always on time. You know, and not that those are not admirable traits, right? I like hard workers. You know, I want you to show up on time, right? But is that what you want the story of your life to be? Is that what I want the story of my life to be? One sentence like that? You know, because if we think about it, the question I'm kind of asking is that what will your story be when that's all that's left of your life is the story that your life built? Right? Because when you're gone, that's what's all that's left behind. The influence you've had, the lives you've interacted with, and ultimately the story that life has built. And the answer to that question is really up to you, right? It's up to me, right? The people can have very challenging lives but still end up with fantastic stories. And I guess the question is that what influences that story that our lives write? I mean, there's a temptation to believe that, well, you know, if I get kind of one or two key decisions right, or I do one or two big things, that's what I'll be remembered for. But in my experience, having done lots of funerals, that's not what defines our stories. What really builds our stories are the daily choices that we make, the daily habits, our interactions with one another, the things that we do day after day. Right? Because a great story doesn't have to mean that you build a huge data center and you rolled out AI. I don't know that's going to be a great story. Right? A great story could be showing up for someone day after day, taking care of others even when it's challenging. Right? Those are the things that build great stories. But I think we think about this idea of our daily practices, and we think about the choices we make day after day, and what motivates those choices. And I think one of the things that we have to be honest with ourselves about is that a big part of the way we behave day after day, a big part of the choices that we make, a big part of the decisions we make day after day comes down to this idea of the weight we carry, right? The gunk that's inside of us that we haven't dealt with, right? The pain that we've encountered in life, right? Difficult experiences. Things that we feel like we're lacking, a desire to be more significant, right? To be more visible, right? To try to overcome self-doubt. You know, I think for many of us, we've had experiences where people have said, well, we are lazy or we are whatever, and we spend our lives trying to prove that that's not who I am. And our choices day after day are not being driven by healthy things. They're driven by what we're wrestling with inside. And I say all that just to say that you're not alone if that's you. You know, that was a long part of my path. I mean, I still do to some degree, hopefully far less than I used to. But a huge chunk of my life was trying to prove that what someone said about me was not accurate. So what that means is that if we're going to build a life where we build the story that I truly believe that we can, we need to do the work to address the issues that we're wrestling with. That we need to be willing to talk with people about it, to get help if we need to be in a support group if we need to, whatever that is. But if we don't address what's going on inside of us, we're not going to build the story that we want. We think that if I can manipulate the story to make it look good, it'll be good. But the people who know us know the truth. And that's the people I'm going to be talking to at your funeral, right? So they're the ones who are going to tell me your story. So take good care of those folks. Know who they are, right? Right, but the reality is that the story that we write with our lives are really the sum total of all those small choices. And so with that in mind, I want to jump back into the narrative that we were in last week. Remember, we were looking at the life of Samson. And if you kind of look at this series as a whole, right, we've been in the book of Judges, just kind of a really select part of the book of Judges, and we're looking at these behaviors that people have had and what they're doing. And one of the things we saw in Samson was a person who was loaded with unhealthy behaviors. Right? If you remember last week, Samson comes from the Old Testament period of the Judges, which is roughly 3,000 years ago. It's a few hundred-year period. And at that time in ancient Israel, there was no real clear political leader. There was no king. The thing that's repeated in the book of Judges, I think it's twice, is people did what was right in their own eyes. And that may sound wonderful, but it means everyone just looked out for number one. That's what it really was about. They weren't really very cooperative. They weren't really doing a good job of supporting each other. And the judges were the ones who were responsible for defending the people. They weren't political leaders, again, they weren't kings. They were mostly responsible for defending their people, and that was Samson. Right? And Samson lived during a period where ancient Israel was under foreign occupation by a group known as the Philistines. Right, so the Philistines occupy ancient Israel. They're in charge. Samson's responsibility is kind of protecting his people from the Philistines. But if you recall last week, what did he do? He actually decided that he was going to marry a woman who was a Philistine. Not because he was madly in love with her, because she was hot. And she was dangerous, right? And we love dangerous women, right? Oh, that was just me, I guess, right? Right, but basically, what does he do? He makes this decision to marry her, or at least try to marry her. It goes really wrong, creates lots of problems, right? Lots of people get hurt, lots of things get damaged, and even the woman and her father ultimately lose their lives because of his decision. And what we see there is the way Samson seemed to look at the world. Right, that Samson was really driven by selfish impulse. Remember the kind of three-step process for Samson's decision-making? I want it. And I know it's kind of outside there, but I'm Samson. I deserve it. Samson, that's really dangerous. I can handle it. Right? I want it. I deserve it. I can handle it. In fact, he seemed to have basically no regard for how things impacted other people. And what we'll find is that if you read the entire narrative of Samson, that behavior is actually the story of his life. That's what his decisions wrote. Was a story of a man who was driven by selfish impulse with little regard for people. Now, if you went to Sunday school, they would tell you about how strong he was and, how he beats this guy up and he beats this crew up. And those things are true. But those things are just tiny pieces of his overall story. If we kind of look at it from it with an adult eye and peel away the easy-to-tell story, and see the truth of his behavior. He's driven by this darkness inside of him, this baggage that he carries. And we don't know what it is. Maybe it was a sense of entitlement. Maybe he just needed to feel loved. Maybe he needed to be seen as significant. I'm Samson. People need to know I'm Samson. Everyone should recognize me when I walk into the room. Maybe he needs validation. I don't know. What I do know, that if we look at his choices and what he does time and time again, a man blessed with so much, with so many abilities, so many opportunities, makes choices over and over again that do damage and do harm. And so if we kind of pick up the narrative where we were at, some time has gone by. since Samson tries to marry the woman. And as a result of that decision, he finds himself in a lot of battles, as well as the rest of his people. In fact, he puts the people he's supposed to be defending, he puts them in grave danger at one point. The Philistines rise up and basically say, if you don't give us Samson, you are all going to pay the price. And so finally the people agree to hand Samson over, and Samson gets really, really close to being captured and it all being over. I mean, he gets like right to the edge. And then at the last minute, he pulls it out, gets away with it, beats up the enemy, and everything's fine. And you would think, getting as close to being captured as that with a group of people who would happily kill him, getting that close, he'd be like, oh man, I got to knock this off. Getting that close, I got to knock this off. He didn't do it. He continues on that path. In fact, as far as we can tell with the information we have, Samson's life was basically defined by recklessness. He just keeps continually living on the edge, right? That he sees the situation is, I always get away with it. I'm going to keep getting away with it because I'm Samson. I mean, look at all that I can do. I'm the greatest warrior in the land. I'm the strongest in the land. I'll always be fine. And it seems to be true, right? Samson was blessed. He had tremendous gifts. He had tremendous abilities. And think of the amazing story that he could have written. He could have been the man who rescued his people. He could have been known as a defender of the weak, someone who lifts up those who are down and who are hurting. He might have even, possibly, had the opportunity to lead his people to freedom. But what we see in Samson is when he looks at the blessings that God has given him, as opposed to developing his abilities and his gifts, as opposed to looking at opportunities as a chance to make a difference, he looks at all that and says, I don't have to worry, I'm good. I can just kind of rest here where I am. I can do what I want. I can behave the way I want. And I'll be fine. And he basically was fine until he wasn't. That eventually that attitude of not leaning into what he could do and not developing his abilities and this continuing behavior of making dangerous, unhealthy choices finally catches up with him when he meets someone. Who does he meet? Delilah. I could do a Tom Jones thing for you if you want, you know. I might be able to do it, actually. Right? My, Delilah. Why, Delilah? Is that woman was no good for me? I think it's sort of thing. I think that's the line. I'm a minor Tom Jones fan. I have sang that in a song in a bar in New York City, by the way. Long time ago. Now, he goes into a valley. In fact, let me read the text to you here. It says this. It says, sometime later, in other words, well after this time of the marriage thing we read about last week, sometime later, Samson fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek whose name was Delilah. Now, where he meets her is really important, the valley of Sorek. The valley of Sorek is a valley located on the edge of the Philistine territory. So what does that tell us? Samson is, again, someplace he doesn't belong. Right? He's not back with his people. Remember, he's a judge. He's supposed to be a defender of his people, a supporter of his people. Instead of being back with his own people, taking care of them like is supposed to be his role, he's off wandering again over in Philistine territory. And there he sees Delilah. And you notice it says that he fell in love with Delilah. Did he fall in love with Delilah? We'll see in a minute. We don't really know much about Delilah. She might have been Philistine. Based on where he meets her, she is almost definitely exotic. And we learned last week that Samson seems to have a thing for exotic women. So when it says he fell in love with her, probably more infatuation, probably more physical attraction. And this is the thing that we find is that Samson doesn't really seem to know himself. Right? He's repeating the same behavior we talked about last week. Right? And there's a third account that we don't cover in this, but there's a third account that's kind of like that, where he's off doing the same sort of thing. And he never really seems to catch up with it. That he just seems to keep making these bad choices, and he keeps pursuing these dangerous situations. And he's convinced he can do it because he always comes out fine. But the thing is that although Samson never really gets to know himself, at least not as far as we can tell, the Philistines get to know him, and they know what his weakness is. And now that he puts himself in the situation, they know what to do. The text says this: the rulers of the Philistines went to Delilah and said, "See if you can lure Samson into showing you the secret of his great strength and how we can overpower him so we may tie him up and subdue him. Each one of us will give you 1,100 shekels of silver." So they're offering her over 5,000 pieces of silver. All she has to do is tell them how to capture Samson. She doesn't even have to do the capturing, right? She just has to tell them how to do it. Now, you might be tempted to say, well, but this is love. She's not going to sell him out. It never says Delilah loved Samson. It says that Samson fell in love with Delilah. And from what we can tell from the text is that basically Delilah receives that offer and she just gets right to work. The next chance she has, she's talking to Samson, and it's like, oh, you're so big, you're so strong. How can that be true? Like, let's just say someone wanted to bind you and subdue you. How would you do that? Just curiosity. Right now, clearly, there's no good reason to ask that question. Right? But we know that Samson doesn't seem to do well in this situation. Remember that last week, right? Samson had a secret. He wanted to hide it from the Philistines. But the girl he was with kept asking him, and eventually he tells the secret. So he should recognize this right away. And it seems that he does recognize it, but he decides to be a bit coy, a bit playful. So when she says, well, let's just say someone wanted to subdue you in a way that you could never break free, he makes up a narrative, he makes up a story. He says, if you tied me with this certain kind of cord that was treated a certain way, I'd be as weak as any man. So he tells her that, falls asleep, wakes up to find himself bound exactly like he described, surrounded by Philistines. Now, because he lied and he could actually break free of this, he does. He breaks free, gets rid of the Philistines, right? But now he's got absolute concrete evidence that Delilah can't be trusted. He told her something that was not really useful that she thought was useful. The exact same thing happened. So certainly now he will run away and get away from all this, right? But he's Samson, right? I'm always fine. So she asks him again because he's still there. And this happens several times. And each time he tells her another lie. And they're usually kind of convoluted, tie me with a certain kind of cord, and it's got to be treated a certain way, and I'll be as weak as any man. Every time he does that, the next time he falls asleep, he is bound up, just like he's described her, surrounded by Philistines. But each time, of course, he breaks free, gets rid of the Philistines, so everything's fine, right? What could possibly go wrong? What ends up happening, and this is something I think we need to be really careful about in our own lives, he's making bad decisions and keeps surviving anyway. So the next time he makes a bad decision, it's a little bit worse. Right? In his case, he tells a lie that's a little bit closer to the truth. And he gets closer and closer to the edge of destruction, right? Because he knows the Philistines are out to get him. He knows she's cooperating with them. And I don't know if he thinks he's just going to charm her out of her behavior. I don't know what he thinks, right? But he is convinced that he'll be fine. And I think it really demonstrates something that we want to be on guard for, right? That Samson never feels the need to address his behavior. He never feels the need to look into why he's making the choices he is, because he lands on his feet, right? He's kind of okay. And if we're honest with ourselves, we all do that in one way or another, right? It might be money. It might be the way we treat the people in our family, right? It could be any number of things that we know that we're doing things that are potentially harmful, but, they'll understand, or it'll be all right, or, yeah, last month was kind of tight, but I made it, so it's all right. Right? We all do that. That we have this tendency to think that because something turns out okay in the short term, we make a bad decision, it comes through, we're kind of okay, we make it, we think it's always going to be okay. Or we think it will never accumulate to be a bigger issue. But when we go to work time after time instead of spending time with our family, and then we finally get to a point in our lives where we're ready to slow down, and we're ready for that time with our family now, and you realize you never built that relationship that you were trying to build. You never built those bonds that you were hoping for, right? And it was built one step at a time, not showing up, not being there, right? It's never too late to try to turn things around. It's never too late to try to write a better story, but we do need to be honest with ourselves that when we are building our story, it may seem fine right now, but as it accumulates, something may hit us down the road, or eventually we'll hit a time where we're just not fine, and things collapse in on us. And that's exactly what happens to Samson. Samson keeps dancing closer to telling Delilah the truth, despite all the information. It seems that he needs, I don't know if he just needs to see himself as loved, that I'm just so wonderful, she couldn't possibly actually turn on me when I tell her the truth. I don't know what he thought. But this is what the narrative tells us. It says, so Samson told Delilah everything. He said, no razor has ever been used on my head because I've been a Nazirite dedicated to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man. So what happens? Right? Next time Samson falls asleep, Delilah cuts off all his hair, and as Samson awakes, the Philistines bust in. And here's what the narrative says. Right? You can tell that Samson is convinced he's still going to be fine. It says, Samson awoke from his sleep and thought, I'll get out of this. Samson awoke from his sleep and thought, I'll get out of this. Wow, I can't say this, sorry. He awoke from his sleep and thought, I'll go out as before and shake myself free. But he did not know the Lord had left him. Key verse, I'm blowing it. I'm going to read it again, right? Samson awoke from his sleep and thought, I'll go out as before and shake myself free. But Samson did not know that the Lord had left him. Right? So Samson had always succeeded before. He had constantly made bad decisions, dangerous decisions. I always got through it just as I did before. He literally says that, right? Just like always before. But this time, it doesn't work out. This time, he is actually captured, beaten, blinded, shackled, and imprisoned. It finally collapses in on him. He finally has to face the choices that he's made. And as I read through that, I'm like, was Samson's strength actually in his hair? Did every follicle have an extra about a bit of muscle in there, a little bit just kind of flying in, and when he didn't have the hair, it's just lost his muscle strength? I think probably not. I think what it really comes down to is what it represented. See, Samson says this point that I've been a Nazirite dedicated to God since my birth. Nazirite is a really important distinction in ancient Israel. A Nazirite, as Samson describes, is someone who has committed their life to God. In other words, I believe God has a call on my life, and I'm going to live my life pursuing that call. That is the promise of a Nazirite, of which Samson is one. As a Nazirite, there were certain things that they did not do. Nazirites did not eat certain foods. Nazirites did not drink certain things. And Nazirites did not cut their hair, because their long hair was supposed to be a symbol of their dedication to God, that they would stand out with that long hair. And Samson's this guy who's supposed to be dedicated to God. He has made this promise to pursue God's calling on his life. Has he been doing that? No. See, I think what happens here is that Samson, at that point, at that step, basically, God had been protecting Samson throughout his life. That Samson was making choices that were deeply dangerous, that had serious consequences. And God kept kind of holding back those consequences from Samson, because God is a gracious God. I will tell you, God has held back many consequences from my life until I finally woke up. And Samson just believed that he could do whatever he wanted, and it would never, ever catch up with him. He had made this commitment to use the blessings in his life, to follow the path that God was calling him on. And he kept using those blessings to just rest in them and do whatever he wanted, that the blessings were all for him. I think what it came down to is Samson having his hair cut off came down to what it represented. It represented the choice that he had been making for a long time to not follow the path God had called him onto. There's the Christian author C.S. Lewis has this I think it's a really good book. Not everyone agrees with me. It's called The Great Divorce. Has nothing to do with divorce. It's an odd title. It's actually a parable, right? So a fictional story with a point sort of thing. And in the book, The Great Divorce, C.S. Lewis says this. He says, Henry, please. I'm sorry, I forgot there we go. So C.S. Lewis says, there are only two kinds of people in the end. Those who say to God, God, thy will be done. And those to whom God says, in the end, okay, your will be done. See, what happened to Samson here is he'd been living out his will all along. And God had been holding back the consequences all this time. And finally, in this moment, as Samson continues to persist at living out Samson's own will, not doing what he was called to do, not using the blessings he's been given to follow where God is trying to take him, instead using it for debauchery, to just, do whatever he wants. In that moment, God says, well, Samson, if that's how you want to live, your will be done. Those actions have consequences. I'm not going to hold them back for you anymore. You made that choice. This is the outcome, the natural outcome of the choice that you have made. I don't see this as God punishing Samson at all. I see this as God has been protecting Samson for a long, long time, as he protects many of us, all of us, I think, for times. And then one day God says, well, if that's your choice, your will be done. This is it. This is what it looks like to do that. This is what it looks like to live like that. This is what it looks like to sit back on the blessings that I have given you and use them to empower your own bad behavior. I think God just honored Samson's choice. Now, Samson would ultimately die in prison. But he has one great moment. Just before he dies, he has this opportunity, creates an event where he knocks down a Colosseum, wipes out a bunch of Philistines. Woo, one great decision. Surrounded by a lifetime of unrepentant bad decisions. I mean, Samson did some good things in his life. We could say Samson did some great things in his life. But Samson never lived up to the life that he'd been called to. He never lived up to the life that God had empowered him to live. He never made the kind of difference that he could have made. Right? And I think that the great tragedy of Samson's life is that if you read through the narrative of Samson, and then you get down to the very last verse and the very last sentence of the very last verse, it sums up Samson's life in one sentence. Samson had led Israel 20 years. That's the story of his life in one sentence. Not that the people were free, not that the weak were protected, not that the hurting were lifted up, that he'd been given so much. Samson's life was filled with gifts, was filled with blessings. He had every opportunity to write an amazing story. But he didn't use those gifts to do that. He rested on them. He viewed everything that God had given him as existing for his own use to do with what he wanted. Everyone did what they saw fit in their own eyes. He just did what he wanted to do for him. And what I know is this behavior was driven by what he was dealing with. He wasn't, I don't know what his issues were. I do know he was driven to self-indulgence. He was chasing exotic women, dangerous relationships. I know people like that. And I know that there's a lot of darkness inside that drives that sort of thing. Right? He was prone to bravado, right? Just seeking to be the center of attention. I know people like that. And all the folks that I know who do that repeatedly are dealing with some darkness inside. So I think it's safe to say that Samson was dealing with some stuff. But he wouldn't deal with it. That's the issue. He let it drive him. And that's the same thing for all of us, right? None of us are clean inside, right? We've all been through stuff. It builds up. It just does. And if we don't deal with it, it will continue to drive us. It will continue to shape us. And we will be at risk of doing exactly what Samson did. Right? You've been given many blessings. I've been given many blessings. And you have a call on your life by God. Before the beginning of time, God had a plan for you and created you to fulfill that plan, but it's your choice whether you follow it or not. It's my choice whether I follow it or not. Right? And then basically, the choice that I have, the choice that you have is that, am I going to look at the blessings that God has given me and say, it's all about me, I'm fine, I can rest on this, I've got enough, I can sit back and do whatever I want? Or am I going to believe that God has called me to something bigger? You're going to believe that God has called you to something bigger. And maybe, just maybe, the blessings you have, the resources you have, the people in your life, the opportunities you have, the skills you've built up, even those very difficult things that you have survived that have helped you to reshape your thinking, is it possible that God has brought those things into your life, or at least allowed those things into your life, so that you can make a difference in other people's lives? That we could come together as a church with all of our individual experiences to make a bigger difference in this community. Is it possible that that just might be true? Or is everything that you have just to be given to you to use however you want? Is everything I have given to me to use however I want, live any way I want, and it'll all be fine? Right? In the end, either I will say to God, thy will be done, or he will say to me, thy will be done. And that choice is the same for all of us. And I believe that we can all write an amazing story with our lives. But I think there are two choices that we have to make. One is that we have to recognize that we are wrestling with things that drive our behavior in a way we really don't want it to go. Or at least our choices, or maybe even just our worldview, whatever that is. None of us are perfect. None of us are clean. So we're going to address that. We're going to do the work to get past that. But then we're also going to ask the question of ourselves, the good things in my life are gifts from God. Am I going to use them just for me, or am I going to use them to make a difference?